Alright, today I'm gonna do a little bit of a impromptu sort of detailing video. And I'm gonna make my best effort at explaining what I'm doing and why I'm doing it. Never really done one of these things before, but I get a lot of requests to do it, so I figured might as well do it on an extremely complicated logo. So, I'm gonna start detailing this with, probably gonna start with some webbing. So I'll just create a new layer. And you'll kind of see why I do this way as things progress. So I'm just gonna get a pretty standard brush, make sure the hardness is set to 100, hit F5, make sure the spacing is set to 1%. And I'm just gonna test how things look. It's important to choose a size that looks good relative to the logo that you're working on. That looks pretty good. I have pen pressure enabled, so I might go just a little bit bigger. So there's a lot of variation, but the minimum width is still big enough at thumbnail size to see. That looks good. With this one, I think I'm going to try and go for a more tension-based web look. So instead of having really loose lines like this, I'm going to try to make them really tight and have them all kind of pulling off of each other. I'm just going to go for it, see what happens. So one of the things that I do is whenever there's a deviation in the line, if I'm trying to go for a really tense webbing, is to create something that branches off of it. For example, right here, the web kind of goes out and then slants down. So I'm going to go off of where that deviation is and create a little bit of tension there. You can see this one kind of slopes down. I'm just going to do the same thing. Now, this isn't something that everyone does, but when I create webs, I like to connect these corners with just a little bit of rounded edges to make it look like it's pulling off of the logo a little bit. It's looking pretty good. For now, I might experiment with having a couple of loose ones here and there, a couple of loose webs. I'm just going to flip it over real quick to see if I like it. It's probably not going to match up with whatever's going on here, but... oh no, there's enough room. Or I spoke too soon. I personally don't like it. I don't like the dripping one. I'm just gonna get rid of that. I also might up my brush size just a little bit. Go over this again. Now the parts I like to tackle first are the parts with the most space in between them to fill things out a bit, but as I'm going along I'll add little ones here and there. And occasionally I'll switch to a black brush instead of a white brush and just paint in a little bit of a cutaway. Right now it doesn't matter too much that I'm not erasing, but I'm painting in these dark lines. Because later we're gonna just load the selection in the channels for all the white, put everything on its own layer, and then eventually I convert that into a vector. So as you can imagine, this process is very long and very time consuming. But like I said, I get asked about this a lot, so figured I might as well finally put something together. Now sometimes it helps if you just create kind of random lines and then make sense of it a little bit later. Gives you kind of a more organic, crazy look to the webs. If I left it just like that, it wouldn't look too great, but once you start adding in the rounded edges, there's a lot more of a thought-out look to it. As you can see, that was just pretty much random. Pretty gross. I'm going to add some smaller details to make it look a little more chaotic and a little more like there's tension on this web. It's being strained on all sides. Get rid of pixel grid. I hate the way that looks. I'm gonna start throwing in a couple of curved lines because it's looking a little too rigid. I'm also gonna start taking into consideration maybe a focal point for all these things to lead to. Or mostly lead to, I guess I should say. I'm going to redraw these, taking into consideration that kind of new angle. Yeah, I like that a lot more. And over time, once all these details start filling in, you'll see it kind of pulling to the center. I think that's going to give it a little bit of a more extreme look. That's not always going to be the case, but I think it'll suit this logo in particular well. There's no real universal rule for any of this. So you just kind of have to tailor what you do to your specific logo. So sometimes if I think the detail is a little inconsistent, I'll draw in one of those cut-ins. Things were looking a little too bland right there, so just drew in one of those, and it gives a little extra level of detail. I might draw in another one around here somewhere. That looks good. There's already a lot of detail going on in this area, so I don't really feel like it needs a cutaway. Just gonna take a quick look, make sure everything's coming together good. Looking good. I'm just gonna add a little bit of kind of sloshy grossness to some of the lines. They're looking a little too stiff. So all I'm doing is drawing little kind of bubbles along the line. Give it a little bit of variation. And I'm drawing them specifically on the underside to look like it's liquid collecting along the web, moving its way down. Now here's a lot of open space. Sometimes I'll change up my method just a little bit for sections like this, give it extra variation. For something like that, I'll really experiment with how much pressure I'm applying and be a little more loose with the lines that I create. And then once I create the lines, I'll kind of add some order to the chaos. So I like to start with something a little thicker, go thinner, and then kind of turn back to it being thick. So, not attached to the logo, it looks something like this. I still want to keep my direction in mind, so I'm just going to redraw that real quick. So, say for example, like I did earlier, when the line starts to deviate too much, I'll pull from it and create a much more rigid line. Here I'm going to do the same thing. It's going to be a little random, but see what comes out of it. That looks pretty gross. So this is one of those sections that's definitely going to need just a little bit of extra detail. So in a section like this, if you look at the directional reference, there's not a whole lot of room for some of these parts to connect, so I'll randomize it just a tiny bit, kind of deviate from the plan, just to make sure that there's something going on to look at on the edges. So right there, the detail was being overwhelmed, or the logo was being overwhelmed by the detail. It was kind of losing some of what it had. So I just drew in an extra line there to extend the branch a little bit. Sometimes it gets kind of hard to decide what to do when you start heading into the interior of the logo where everything's bunched together. A good way to look at it is just to take a big chunk of empty space, or the biggest one you could find, and then kind of divide it. So for example, this is kind of standing out to me. So I'm just gonna cut straight through with something, maybe add a little extra line. Maybe divide this little extra area here. It's always good to zoom out and take a look at what's going on. Kind of get a feel for where things need to be adjusted. It's really easy to get trapped in working in a tiny spot and then you realize you've added way too much detail. So all I'm doing at this point is finding the most wide open spots and then kind of creating a little bit of webbing to add some detail. This is probably the most tedious part of any extreme death metal logo with this level of detail. Now, sometimes there's a real temptation to just fill in everything you see. It kind of comes with just how tedious this process is. There's no real right answer to doing any of this. You just kind of have to go by your feeling. For example, I could fill in this section with some extra detail, but I kind of like a break from the monotony of all the chaos that's going on in here, so I'm just going to leave that as is. Sometimes the lines are naturally going to take over the sort of branches and spikes that you created. So in that instance, I just converted that into a web just by overlapping it and drawing in some of my regular details over it. Just gonna take a look at how it would look flipped. It's not gonna line up perfectly or anything. I'm just trying to get a idea for level of detail. And as you can see, it's pretty goddamn ridiculous. It's really important that you kind of take a break every once in a while. Let yourself kind of readjust to looking at things. It's really easy to get swept up in all the detail, and sometimes you have to readjust your perspective on the project just to make sure that you're doing the right thing and not overdoing it. So I'm probably gonna reach about halfway and then take a little break, let my eyes readjust. Alright, so that's about the halfway point. I'm gonna flip it over, just take a quick look at everything that's happened so far. Looking pretty ridiculous. Alright, picking stuff up. So I have a bit more trouble drawing from the right to left than I do left to right. So when I get to this stage where I've done about half of the logo, I like to just flip the canvas. I find it easier to work that way. Okay. So I'm trying to make sure that the level of detail is consistent between the two different sides. It's really important. Since I'm starting up again, it's very easy for this to get lopsided without referencing what's going on the other side of the logo. So that's about the level of detail I'm looking for with this. I think if I try to add too much more webbing, it'll be a bit overwhelming. So now I'm going to move on to drips. First thing I'm going to do is flip the canvas back over. Actually, the first thing I'm going to do is add tiny little cuts into the logo in places where there's too much detail. I'm not seeing a lot of places that really qualify, but I find that the best places to add those are places where it looks like letters are stretching across one another. Gives this kind of ripping sort of look. I don't know if this logo will benefit from it at all, but I'm gonna draw just a little bit of circular splats here and there. Probably not gonna go for that. But I will try some drips. Nothing complicated going on here, just holding down Shift and drawing some pretty simple lines. And that's about it. Thanks for watching.